Hi, in this video I'm going to be going through a few problems from practice problem set 3-4. This is another practice problem set that has to do with translating from English to the language of truth functional logic, and also one in which I have specified the variable assignment for you. We can use up to 3 variables in this practice problem set. P stands for Peru conducts military operations inside Ecuador. Q, Colombia conducts military operations inside of Ecuador. And R, Ecuador mobilizes its army. Here, our translations can include conditionals, as well as negation, conjunction, and disjunction, and sometimes parentheses for grouping. I will be doing, as I work through several of these, I will be doing intermediate step translations where I let the variable letters stand for the simple statements to which they have been assigned, leaving any other wording that might indicate logical structure and leaving any punctuation that might help us figure out grouping in our translations. Again, when you do translations yourself to turn them in as homework, you can do intermediate steps if you want. Doesn't bother me to see that on your assignments that you turn in. You do not have to do those. Doesn't bother me if they're not there either. Either way, whatever you find most helpful. All right, let's start with number 1, which says, if Peru does not conduct military operations inside Ecuador, but Colombia does, comma, then Ecuador will mobilize its army. So let's see. Doing our intermediate step, we've got if Peru does not. Notice the word not, that's indicating negation, so let me put the negation sign there. Then we've got but, indicating logical structure. Colombia does, that's Q, comma. Then Ecuador will mobilize its army, that's R. So here's what we're going to work from to get our final translation. If negation sign P but Q, comma, then R. Well, let's start with negation sign P but Q. I've circled that for the moment just to indicate grouping. The comma here helps us understand the separation between the antecedent and consequent of this conditional. If there were no comma, we would understand the grouping in the same way, however, because this thing that I've got circled is between if and then, it must be grouped together as the antecedent of this condition. In other words, our translation of negation P but Q is going to go before the arrow in the antecedent position. But is a contrast word. Contrast words or phrases, when they indicate any logical structure at all, indicate conjunction, and the ampersand is what we use to represent conjunction, so there we are. And finally, complete this translation by picking up the letter R from after the word then and placing the letter R in the consequent position after the arrow. All right, I want to go now to number 5. This says Ecuador will mobilize its army, that's R, if, and, oh no, if, I've started to jump ahead in my head, so let me start this one again. R for Ecuador mobilizes its army if either Peru or Colombia conducts military operations inside of Ecuador. The word if introduces the antecedent of a conditional. What's the antecedent of this conditional then? Well, that's either P or Q. You can see that the word either comes immediately after the word if, indicating that the antecedent of this conditional has to be the disjunction P or Q. So let's group that together inside of parentheses. Disjunction, again, we represent with the wedge, so P wedge Q is the antecedent. R by itself then has to be the consequent. Do not let the fact that if is not at the beginning of the way the conditional is expressed in the English, but in the middle. Don't let that fact confuse you as to the translation here. Whether if is at the beginning of the English expression or somewhere in the middle makes no difference to our translation. In either case, if introduces the antecedent. So we take whatever's after if and put it in the antecedent position, meaning before the arrow. All right, 6 is only slightly different from 5. The only difference between 6 and 5 is that in 6, we have the word only. It said, Ecuador will mobilize its army, that's R, only if either Peru or Colombia conducts military operations inside of Ecuador. That's the only difference between 5 and 6. But it's a very important difference. The word if, used by itself like it was in number 5, introduces the antecedent of a conditional. The phrase only if is importantly different than the word if by itself. Both let you know you're looking at a conditional. They share that in common. But they are different in that they introduce different parts of a conditional. Only if introduces the consequent. So now our translation of either P or Q is the consequent rather than the antecedent. So it has to go after the arrow rather than before it. Only difference between 5 and 6 is the position of antecedent and consequent, and that was signaled in the original English by the difference between the word if by itself and the phrase only if. All right, keep that in mind, and actually I'm going to erase this variable assignment. I don't think we need it in front of us. And if you do, you can just look back at the book. But I want room to write number 14 up here. It says, Ecuador will mobilize its army, that's R, if and only if Peru conducts military operations inside of Ecuador. We only have 2 variables for this one. The thing to focus on here is the phrase if and only if. In talking about numbers 5 and 6, I was talking about the difference between the word if by itself and the phrase only if. If by itself introduces an antecedent, only if introduces a consequent. Here we have them both with and between them. And indicates conjunction. Overall, then, here we are going to be looking at a conjunction. Each conjunct now is going to be a conditional. What is the difference between those 2 conditionals? It's the difference that corresponds really to the difference between the word if by itself and the phrase only if. One of those introduces the antecedent, one introduces the consequent of a conditional. And we've got the same variables in each case. So I've got R arrow P, inside parentheses is the first conjunct, P arrow R, inside parentheses is the second conjunct. You can see the only difference between those 2 conditionals is that the way the antecedent and consequent are in one is switched or reversed in the other. That's it. That's it. In a conjunction, as I hope you remember, the order of the conjuncts is irrelevant to the truth value of the entire conjunction. In other words, P ampersand Q and Q ampersand R would have the same truth values. So here you could also reverse the order of antecedent and the order of the conjuncts. It'd be the same in terms of truth functional equivalence. Either one would be correct. All right. want to go over two more from this practice problem set with you. And in doing so, I'll be covering the phrases sufficient condition and necessary condition. Sufficient condition and necessary condition. Actually, we'll focus on both of those phrases in number 15. As an intermediate step for 15, let's see. Colombia conducting military operations inside Ecuador, that's Q, is a sufficient condition for what? Ecuador mobilizing its army, that's R, and Peru conducting military operations inside of Ecuador, that's P, is a necessary condition for Colombia doing so. Colombia doing so is Q. I'm using SC as short for sufficient condition, NC as short for necessary condition. The phrasing of necessary condition and sufficient condition is not used very commonly in ordinary American English, or US, I should say, English in the United States. That's not even exactly correct. It is very common in English in some other parts of the world, Great Britain, India, as two examples. And generally speaking, there are exceptions to this, but it's just kind of a general tendency. Parts of the world that used to be part of the British Empire, in those parts of the world, the vocabulary of sufficient condition and necessary condition is fairly commonly used to this day, much more so than in the United States. Now, I can't quite say US English because certainly there are a lot of people in the United States who come, for example, from the country of India. And they are more likely, depending on how recently or long ago they immigrated, they may be more or less likely to use this terminology that's more common in Great Britain than people who've been in this country longer will be. At any rate, I do want you to be able to understand terminology from other parts of the world, logical terminology, so sufficient condition, necessary condition are important. A sufficient condition is the consequent of a conditional. Let me repeat that. A sufficient condition is the consequent of a conditional. You notice that I did not say the phrase sufficient condition introduces something. No. I was using the terminology of introduces when I was talking about the word if, or talking about the phrase only if. But when we're talking about what the phrases sufficient condition and necessary condition do, introduction, that concept, is completely irrelevant. It would be misleading. We'd be more likely than not to come up with incorrect translations if we thought of it that way. We have to think about what it is. A sufficient condition is an antecedent. So if you just focus on the part before the comma, we've got Q is a sufficient condition for R. Because a sufficient condition is an antecedent, that tells us that in this conditional here, Q is the antecedent. Okay, we've got some parentheses for grouping, and is giving us conjunction, is expressing conjunction, which we represent with the ampersand. Now let's turn to the last of this. P is a necessary condition for Q. Again, the phrasing of necessary condition does not introduce part of a conditional. The concept of introduction is mistaken here. A necessary condition is a consequent. So whatever this says is the necessary condition, we have to put in the consequent position, and that means we have got to put it after the arrow. In other words, P is a necessary condition for Q, gets translated as Q arrow P. All right, I want to do one more with you here. That's number 16. Which says Ecuador will mobilize its army, that was R, if but only if either Peru or Colombia conducts military operations inside Ecuador. Either P or Q. If but only if. Let's think about that. If but only if. But when it indicates any logical relationship at all, indicates conjunction. So this first part of what we're going to translate might as well have said are, if, and only if, rather than but. If and only if. Okay, we know that this is going to give us a conjunction, where each conjunct is a conditional. We'll get one of those conditionals from the use of the word if, introducing an antecedent. We'll get the other one of those conditionals from the use of the phrase only if, introducing a consequent. It does not matter what order we put those in. Let me kind of spell something out here though. One is going to come from are if either P or Q. We're going to overall have a conjunction. And then our other conjunct is going to come from are only if either P or Q. Okay? Let me erase what I have above this. And above it, we'll get our translation of are if either P or Q. If introduces the antecedent, so now either P or Q is going to be the antecedent. That's P wedge Q, grouped together inside of parentheses. Well, now let's go to our only if either P or Q. Only if gives us, or introduces, I should say, the consequent. So now P or Q is going to be the consequent. And again, that's translated as P wedge Q and grouped together inside of parentheses. What we've got to do now is put together this with this. Because overall what we need here is a conjunction. Add another set of parentheses for grouping, and then put another set of parentheses around that conjunct. You see now the logical symbol that's not buried inside of parentheses is the symbol that represents conjunction, the ampersand. The fact that the ampersand is not inside of parentheses tells us that overall it is the symbol that indicates the main structure here. In other words, overall what we're looking at here, structurally speaking, is a conjunction, where each conjunct you see signaled by these arrows, each conjunct is a conditional, and the only difference between those two conditionals is the order of the antecedent and consequent. So yeah, this is a complex translation, and I would say a rather difficult one as well. I hope that it makes sense to you now that I've gone through this one in some detail with you. But if you have questions about any of this material, definitely please let me know so that I can help you with it. I'll talk to you again soon.